I'm here with frequent guest Richard James DeSocio, is the author of Clash of Dynasties. For those of you who are just joining us with our first conversation, we have several that we've already done, going back to the rise of the Rockefellers from the 19th century. We focused a lot, still not done, on the Rockefeller alleged role with November 22nd, 1963. I think it's important, though. Richard, your book continues after the assassination into your Rockefeller research. How far do you go in Clash of Dynasties?
Well, I go past the death of David Rockefeller.
Which
I
was
mean, well, my
2002?
book, Clash of Dynasties, was published in 2017. David Rockefeller died that year. He was alive when it was released. So nobody can accuse me of accusing dead people of things. And Henry Kissinger was alive. Oh, well, he just died recently. I forgot that, within the last year or two.
So,
But, yeah,
with what you're seeing going on in the world today, are you still seeing the hand of Rockefeller being played out?
absolutely. It's the one world government under Rockefeller, the UN, one world government. They own the property that the UN is built on. And then across the street, they put up a Chase branch office. You have to go from, you talk about conspiracy, you have to go from JFK assassination. Now, you get the death of Oswald, the assassination of Oswald. Now, who dies next? Bobby. Okay. Obviously, if Bobby got into the White House, he would have discovered a lot of things about the Rockefellers. They weren't going to let him in. Okay, so now you go to what? Okay, so you get the assassination of Bobby Kennedy. Now, all these things line up with Nelson Rockefeller's ambition to be president. Because in October 1963, October 9th of 1963, Governor Nelson Rockefeller announced his candidacy for the White House. Now, that was the second run. He ran in 1960, but he dropped out to back JFK. Okay. Now you come forward at 68. He's well, actually, at 64, he was the leading Republican candidate right up to almost like the second or third night of the Republican convention. And he got edged out by Barry Goldwater, who were the far right of the Republican Party. Now you go to 68, he's in the thick of it again. He's running with Reagan. He's running with Nixon. Of course, Nixon got it. And he's right in the thick of it. And then you go Watergate. Now, what's going on in Watergate? You got the third brother, Ted, and he's got presidential aspirations. 1971, the poll said he would win, Ted Kennedy could win a Democratic primary. Of course, he would have had to face off against Nixon, okay, against an incumbent. But here's the thing. Who knows? Stranger things have happened. Suppose Nixon died, okay, of natural causes even. But here's the thing. Who ran in 1972? Watergate was just before. What were they doing? The Watergate burglars were listening on Ted Kennedy. They were national Democrat headquarters. They were trying to find out information about Ted Kennedy. If you remember All the President's Men, Howard Hunt took out every book in the National Library on the Kennedys. And they went to Chappaquiddick looking for dirt on Ted Kennedy. They were trying to break Kennedy. They wanted to destroy his presidential aspirations. Now, here's the kicker. Who ran 72 at the bottom of the ticket?
McGovern.
McGovern ran at the top of the ticket. But who ran at the bottom of the ticket? Kennedy, Sergeant Shriver. I also saw him, and I was very close to him. I almost reached out to shake hands with him. I got swallowed in a crowd. So he came at the state fair. He was campaigning. I forgot. He ran a couple campaigns. So here you got Sergeant Shriver on the ticket. What happened? Stranger things can happen. Suppose Nixon died. Suppose Nixon was assassinated. Suppose McGovern got it. You got a Kennedy back very close to the White House. The Rockefellers didn't want this. So everything lines up with the Rockefellers. And it's all one big conspiracy.
So where do
And
you
that's
see, but where do you see the Rockefeller hand in Watergate then?
Tell me about Watergate. I asked everybody this question. Okay. Richard Nixon resigned. Yeah. Well, what happened? President Ford, who was not elected, and oh, by the way, he was on the Warren Commission cover up. So you see how it all flats in with Nelson Rockefeller? Now, I think Watergate they were looking for dirt on Ted Kennedy. Okay. If you read All the President's Men, who was coming up with, these people had barrels of cash in the office of the committee to reelect the president, which was Nixon, okay? Uh, I'm sorry, John Mitchell, he was the head of it. John
Right.
Mitchell was a
The Attorney
Democrat, by the way.
General.
Yeah, but he worked with Nelson Rockefeller. With Nelson Rockefeller for years, he went to work for Nelson Rockefeller for years as governor, and then Nelson Rockefeller was involved in the federal government, the federal housing. They were building housing in New York State. They're okay. We can get into all that stuff. So they had garbage cans full of money. Where was the money coming from? Standard Oil. Read all the president's men. They were coming up with like, well, they confessed to a quarter of $250,000, $250 million. Who knows the full extent of it? Now, where's this money? Where's this cash? They're not supposed to have this cash. It's a secret slush fund. Well, they're not supposed to have that. They never explained. The Watergate burglars, those stacks of $100 bills were coming from the Rockefellers. And also, Nelson Rockefeller was the head of the committee to reelect the president, that President Nixon, of course, in New York State. So what do you got in New York State? What do you got in Manhattan? You got the corridors of these skyscrapers full of corporate headquarters. So they're going down the main streets of Manhattan, collecting money from all these corporations. And then there's the tie-in, of course, to Howard Hughes and the casinos in Vegas. That's another story we can get into.
Yes, yes, Hughes is another story, but
and a lot of money from the Watergate garbage cans was coming from casinos that he owned in Las Vegas. And Watergate burglar Gordon Liddy was carrying bundles of cash and dumping them in. Now, here's the thing about Hughes. Okay, now he was in the oil business. He was in a lot of business, but one of his business originally was the oil business. Okay, his father was Texaco, which now is all merged into one big Chevron now. Okay, so I don't want to lose my train of thought, but Hughes earned over $6 billion in what they call non-competitive cost-plus contracts. In other words, all they do is send a bill to the government and they get paid. Well, there's the unwritten law in Washington, and this has been on the news recently. I don't want to bring up names now. I don't want to get too political. About the 10% kickback. Read Bobby Kennedy's book. Read Robert Blakey's book. Read Walt Sheridan's book. They all work for the Kennedy Justice Party. They all wrote books. The 10% kickback. Okay, Howard Hughes is getting $6 billion in contracts from Washington for the Army, for the CIA, and other programs. He needs, you do the math, he needs $600 million he's got to kick back to Washington. Now, this wasn't overnight, over a period of years. So he needs a cash cow. So he bought all these, he sold his airlines, TWA, TWA. He sold his airlines and bought those casinos. It was rumored he was losing money. He didn't care about those casinos. He wanted cash, okay, that he could go to and pay off these officials, the elected officials, and it was all bribe money. And then he had a lot of underworld gangsters working in accounting and skimming off the money for him. And Gordon Liddy was flying out there with suitcases full of money and flying it back to Washington. That's what they were doing.
All right. Let's go back.
Sorry, did I get off the track?
Let's go back to Watergate, though.
All right, Watergate's big with me.
So where did you come to the conclusion that Ted Kennedy was the focus was it just for the Watergate burglary itself, or there was, like, for instance, the Daniel Ellsberg office, there were multiple things going on. So where do you see this Kennedy thing coming into play? I have not, other than you, I've never really heard that Ted.
Well, read all the president's men.
I have read all the president's.
But look at it. But look at it. You got the death of JFK. You got the death of Robert Kennedy, right? Also the assassination of Marshall. Now we're 68. You've still got Nelson Rockefeller speaking the White House. All right. Now you come to 72. Who's out there? Ted Kennedy, the third brother. Okay. This guy has aspirations to be president. Okay. All right. Opposed in 1971 were saying he would win the Democratic primary. They have to stop the third brother. He wasn't a problem in the Senate. Well, he's not a big problem. But in the White House, he could become a big problem. So they had to stop the third brother. They were looking for dirt on Kennedy to destroy him politically. This is what they do. They're dirty tricks. Okay. Now, I do believe that those burglars were little black tape over the door latch. They got caught by accident. But then this became an opportunity for Rockefeller. Well, we'll get Nixon out of the way, and now I can step back in there again. And what happened? Here's Nelson Rockefeller, Vice President of the United States, one step. And if Squeaky Fromm had done her job, as a Manchurian candidate, I believe, Nelson Rockefeller would have been president.
Well, so in your scenario then about
Right.
looking for dirt on Ted Kennedy, is Nixon himself in on this?
Of course. Who's his right-hand man in the White House? Kissinger.
Okay.
Kissinger was basically the number two guy in the Rockefellerocracy. He was the number two guy in the Rockefeller Incorporated, the Rockefeller, whatever you want to call it, the Rockefeller. He was the number two guy. He's next to the White House, next to the president. Why do you think I believe they killed Kennedy? Not to sheer power, but to aggrandize their power. Okay, here's Kissinger. Oh, they had nothing to do with Watergate. All the presidents spent, except for Kissinger and Nixon. Come on, I'm not going to buy that for a word. And actually, it was Mitchell who called Nixon to get the okay for the burglary. Somebody overheard the conversation, and Nixon said it was Mitchell who called Nixon to get the okay for the break-in, and the president gave the okay, so he's involved with this. And Mitchell worked for who? Rockefeller. Mitchell's law firm was in the Chase Bank building, I believe, at one time, the Rockefeller Bank. They're all Rockefeller agents. If you look at their background, you trail their background, they all trail back to the Rockefellers. They trail back to their corporations, their banks, their oil companies, or their think tanks, or their universities, or whatever. They all tie right back to Rockefeller. Go ahead.
I don't doubt that about how they're all sort of connected to but is that intentional? Because when you have something that's so big in terms of a conglomerate like Standard Oil or something, they're naturally going to have interests and entities and so many tentacles in so many different places.
I don't think it's coincidence. I think it's the invisible hand of the Rockefellers that work hard, and it goes on and on and on and on and on. It never stops. And as I said, Watergate, where did the money from Watergate? We talked about Howard Hughes, but also Standard Oil, the Rockefellers. They confessed in front of Senate hearings that they put in $250,000 in secret slush fund. Okay. So these burglars, they're going around with what? Money from the Rockefellers, money from their Standard Oil. Nelson Rockefeller was the head of the committee to reelect President Nixon in New York State. So they're going down Fifth Avenue, they're going down Park Avenue, they're going down Wall Street collecting money.
Now
And
you're putting a lot of stock in Woodward and Bernstein's reporting, Richard.
you know, I don't have a lot of respect for those two guys, to be honest with you. I think they were
Why?
useful idiots of the Rockefellers. But you can't take I don't think you could well listen, they work for who? They work for the Washington Post. Okay. Ben Bradley, who was running the Washington Post, came over from Newsweek. Okay. Newsweek was run by New York's four richest men, Vincent Astor, who was the biggest owner of it, John Hay Whitney, who I connected to the Kennedy assassination, Paul Mellon, well, the Mellon family, steel, oil, all kinds of things, very close with the Rockefeller. And the third name, I think, was Abel Harriman. Now, Vincent Astor, we go back to the Astor Roosevelt spy ring. And I believe, for almost 20 years, Newsweek was in the Knickerbocker Hotel, which is really right in the heart of Times Square, which was owned by the Astor family. It was run by Vincent Astor. So they must have been running this operation right out of the Knickerbocker Hole for 20 years. And then Ben Bradley, how could he not know about this stuff? He goes over to the Washington Post. Now, who owned the Washington Post? And record, it was Eugene Meyer. Okay. Eugene Meyer was a managing partner of Lazard, which is a brokerage firm, so-called. Okay. Where are they headquartered? 30 Rockefeller Plaza. And actually, Lazard now, after David died, they moved into Rockefeller family offices, which is room 5600. But actually, it's more than one room, but they just call it that. And his daughter, his daughter, well, son-in-law, his daughter was famously connected with the Washington Post. Okay. Catherine Graham, right? You know the name.
Yeah.
She's Catherine Meyer Graham. Well, her husband was found shot to death.
Supposedly lost his mind.
Well, naturally, they're going to tell you this. He got drunk, went to the podium one night in a national convention for publishers, newspaper publishers, and he said that Mary Pinchot, and President Kennedy were having a tour affair. And that broke that story. And then shortly after, I forgot the exact time, it's in my book, he was found shot to death in his bedroom in his pajamas All right. And of course, Mary Pitchat was married to a CIA agent, Cord Meyer, no relation to Eugene Meyer.
Okay.
And Mary Pitchat, she was an heiress. She was a socialite. So she was very involved in the Rockefeller world and in their foundations and their philanthropy, especially in the University of Chicago, which is pretty much the creation of the Rockefellers. That
In terms of actually trusting the reporting, though, of Woodward and Bernstein, I mean, where are you at?
well, first of all, I think they were useful idiots of the Rockefellers. Okay, they wanted to destroy Richard Nixon, and this gave Nelson Rockefeller another batting opportunity at the White House. Okay, a lot of that information came from Senate hearings, the Watergate hearings. Standard Oil, the Rockefellers, their company, went before the United States Senate. All right, the Senate, the Watergate hearings, which I remember well, and they confessed to this. $250,000 in cash dumped in the garbage cans. Who's overseeing it? John Mitchell. All right, at the committee. All right, the committee elected Richard Nixon. So this is the money that went from those garbage cans, from Standard Oil into those garbage cans, and then it went to Watergate burglars. So why would it not be connected with the Rockefellers? They're financing all this espionage to destroy Ted Kennedy. Now, Nelson Rockefeller doesn't have a crystal ball. He doesn't know for sure, Ted's got a little bit of a way to go to get it to the White House, but Nelson, stranger things can happen. Okay. Nelson can't sleep nights, my opinion now. Worried about Ted, worried about the third brother. And then he pops up as vice president. Before you know, he's vice president, and Gerald Ford was on the Warren Commission. How could this be coincidence? It's an invisible hand and manipulation of the Rockefeller. I could go on and on for hours.
You've mentioned the
Every day.
Richard, you mentioned the University of Chicago. Remind us.
Rockefeller was essentially, it's made it into a massive institution. It was just a little divinity school. I think Stephen Douglas had a role in founding it. He's the guy who used to debate Abraham Lincoln. All those universities were just little divinity schools. They become their brain trusters, and the Rockefellers have brain trusters in every sector, in business and law and oil, petroleum, banking, world trade, you name it, espionage. Allen Dulles was their master spy crafter in that world, in their spy world. So they have all these different, and then they were carrying out a conspiracy that involved the Dulles brothers, because they were taking these foundations, a network of foundations. They were sitting various family members, they're interlocking them with various foundations, like the Dulles family, the Bundy family. There was a father and two sons. Okay, McBundy was Kennedy's
George McBundy.
Yeah, Kennedy's national security advisor. Dean Ross, president of the Rockefeller Foundation. He was Kennedy's Secretary of State. Okay, C. Douglas Dillon, Rockefeller Foundation. I usually bring the list up every time I talk. I always bring the list up of the people who served on the Rockefeller Foundation. Anyway, but John Dill, here it is. J. Richardson Dilworth. You talk about an octopus. He ran the family office for the Rockefellers. He's got how many corporations and banks and museum boards, and it goes on and on and on to his connections. See, and they're all in the Rockefeller family office. So if he's in the Rockefeller family office, who's running all these corporations and banks and things that he was on? It's the Rockefeller. Here's another one I found. You ever heard of this guy?
Robert B. Anderson?
Yeah. Secretary of Treasury for Eisenhower.
Okay.
He was prosecuted and sentenced by Giuliani. I think he did time. Okay. For money laundering, drug money. Okay. Where was his offices? One Rockefeller Plaza, right across the street from Eastern Airlines, where David Ferry, David Ferry, Eastern Airlines is right out of there, right across the street. So is this a cabal of criminals? This is the octopus I'm talking about. This ain't coincidence.
Let's go before we lose you here. I want to go down to Latin America. When Israel was trying to get into the UN, you remember who was the individual who was really responsible for securing the Latin American and South American votes for Israel to get into the UN?
I'm sorry, I don't know that.
It's Nelson.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that. Sorry. Thank you.
But it makes sense to you, right? That guy had basically Latin America in his pocket at the same time in which the UN was formed, right?
He was the king of Latin America and Central America. There's no doubt about it.
He was the king, and
Right.
he attended, right?
Who went with? He went with Cord Meyer,
Right.
Mary Pinchas.
Back up a little bit, Richard, so I can so I can see your
Oh, I'm
face.
sorry.
There you go.
Okay, he went with Cord Meyer. He didn't have any title. But listen, we talked about this before. When the Rockefellers are in the room, who's giving the orders? It's the Rockefellers. Okay. This idea that they just gave all their money away, just going to be good deed. No, good deed doers and collect artwork. No, and they took that principle into every other sector: steel, banking, textiles, mining. Okay, so anyways, what happened? A lot of these businesses were owned by wealthy families, prominent dynastic families going back some case centuries. So one day Rockefeller walks in and says, "Okay, we're bringing you into the octopus, whether you like it or not. Okay, here's your deal. If you don't like it, you can go be left to the wolves and go bankrupt. Okay, because you're not going to compete with big business anymore." So these families were selling out to Rockefeller. So they all became lesser and lesser in stature, and a lot of them did serve roles. If you look into the history of people like even Dilworth, he was from old money, very old wealthy money. On his mother's side, his grandfather was a general in the Civil War or something. See, they were old, family, wealthy, but they had sold out to the Rockefellers. So then some of them were asked to serve in this greater Rockefeller empire. So actually, these old families were subservient to the Rockefellers, the Rockefeller monopolists. So even in the case of Harold Pratt, Charles Pratt. He was in the oil business in New York City, and he wasn't going to sell out to Rockefeller. He fought Rockefeller, him and Henry Rogers. Then one day they sold out to Rockefeller. Okay, and then they all became big shots. Like Harold Pratt, his home is the home for the Council on Foreign Relations. It's down the corner of 68 Park Avenue. Okay, we talked about those addresses so many times. So the
Yeah.
Pratt family all had big jobs in Standard Oil. They made more money with Standard Oil than they did on their own.
Okay.
So all of them became second. The Vanderbilts, the Astors, all these,
Yeah.
everything. David Rockefeller said the land between Fifth Avenue and Sixth Avenue, of course, where he built Rockefeller Center, was the preserves of the Vanderbilts and Astors. So these people were selling out to this new wealth.
Okay. Tell me that David Rockefeller quote where he says, "If I've been accused of supporting my family or running a secret cabal, I'm proud of it," or something.
Yeah. He did say that in his book. He said that I don't know if it was in his book. It said it somewhere. I think it's in his book.
Yeah.
If I did all that, then I'm proud of it. I've got a lot more on David Rockefeller.
Yeah.
I because this research I'm doing is leading me back to David Rockefeller's words, and his words are published in I think he published his book close to it. In fact, I showed you he wrote me a letter
Yeah.
because I wrote him a letter. I wish I'd put more, and I never thought he'd respond, but he did.
Guys, everybody stick with us. We're gonna have more from Richard coming up soon. Thanks.